Good morning, everybody. Good evening, good afternoon, and good night, depending on where you are. Okay, so the topic that we're going to be exploring today is navigating the intersection of AI and equity. I would like to introduce myself first. My name is William Hardaway. I'm originally from Weldon, Texas, so a Southerner. I'm an instructional designer, product designer, service designer. So at the university, I focus a lot on inclusion in the classroom. I designed this course, equity-minded pedagogy, and so uh, it's a it's a community practice. We have about 200 some odd faculty across our California State University system go through this community practice with me each semester. And we just talk about how to bring more inclusion and equity into the classroom and how to strengthen the connection and learning between students and professors. I'm also a product designer, so I work in the tech industry, designing applications and apps. I've been diving into designing apps with AI as a component as of the past 2 years. I don't know too well. I know a lot about the coding and training side of things, but more about the actual implementation. I was at the Google Cloud Next conference last year in San Francisco, and it really worried me their kind of perception of where education and AI and online stuff was going. There were a lot of folks that just made the leap that we will no longer need brick and mortar institutions. And I'll talk about my kind of challenge with that because if in order for us to really critique and get critical distance away from AI, which is a concept we'll explore later, we need community. And it's really hard with the outcomes for massive online courses to have community. And so I'll talk about that a bit later too. My hobbies are spending time with my family, hip hop. My guilty pleasure is hip hop gossip. For all of you that follow hip hop gossip in the podcast sphere, you probably know what I mean. So definitely a guilty pleasure. Art, writing, and I'm an industrial design enthusiast. Um, the pictures to the right, one is of me and a group of designers and developers I work with when we attended the Google Cloud Next conference. One is of the equity-minded pedagogy community of practice that we have going on coming up this semester for faculty in the California State University system. Uh, the middle picture is number 7 in this picture is my grandfather. He started a school on our property when I was the property that I grew up on for black kids in our area because there was no school. This was before Separate but Equal. And so my father, my aunts, my uncles, they all attended the school, and you could see the age range. So it was one teacher per all these different course levels. And so that's what inspires me to have like a community of practice. No matter where you start, you can all each one can teach one kind of concept. I also do, like I was saying, my hobbies are writing. I've written several children's books that have themes in equity and diversity. And then I write several articles just about various topics. Some of the more recent articles I've been writing have been about AI and empathy, and we'll get into that later as some of the implications for AI as a tool for empathy and some of the ethical implications for if we don't have critical distance, what that does to us. So first, I want to get started with the delayed chat activity. So this activity is designed to help participants identify and explore their fears about the use of AI in higher education. If you've attended any previous sessions with me, I always kind of start with this because there are a lot of concerns and fears around artificial intelligence and machine learning, especially in the context of higher ed. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a timer for a minute, And the prompt is, what is one fear you have about AI and equity? And so we're all going to type into the chat and not hit enter until the timer goes off. So what is one fear you have about AI and equity? And Sean, if you could also type that into the chat for folks to be able to read, that would be helpful. What is one fear you have about AI and equity? And the 1 minute timer is starting now. We got about 30 seconds remaining. 10 seconds remaining. And so you can go ahead and hit enter if you haven't already. So a fear of folks not having access, a fear of folks that need a tool like this the most not having access to it, a fear of losing a sense of reality, students not understanding the difference between AI as a tool and AI as a means of cheating and plagiarism. AI as a tool kind of amplifying our already inherent biases as a society, growing the digital divide. And so these are definitely concerns that I hear quite a bit when I talk to folks about AI in particular. And so these are some things that we're going to unpack and explore because it's not that these things do not exist. The question becomes, how do we mitigate uh, these expected and um, currently active problems that have us fearful of artificial intelligence and machine learning? So, there's several concerns, right, when it comes to artificial intelligence and how it can deepen oppression and how it can amplify bias that we have as a society. And a lot of that resides in kind of this black box problem with artificial intelligence. So we have read stories and watched videos on how AI, especially in this generative AI phase, how it is capable of machine learning and providing predictive outputs. And it's clear by creators of AI, programmers of AI, trainers of AI, that it's a black box. So the initial algorithm is created so that AI can learn and generate predictive text, but we don't really understand how it makes the choices and decisions that it does make. Um, and the scary part is that AI for the past couple decades has been regularly used to make judgments about humans in contexts ranging from medical treatments to who gets approval for a loan to which applicants should get a job interview. And so I think our concerns when it comes to this particular issue are very, very valid because this has been going on for some time. If you're not familiar with Jennifer Ebenhardt's work at Stanford, she worked with, just to show you kind of the way that technology can amplify bias. She worked with the Nextdoor app, and if you're familiar with like apps like Nextdoor or Neighbor, these are apps that like in within your zip code or your vicinity, your neighborhood, it provides a social platform so community members can communicate and dialogue about things that are going on in the neighborhood. Well, there's oftentimes a lot of suspicion of people that look unfamiliar in the neighborhood, and people that may have criminal intent being in neighborhoods. And if you haven't gone on those apps, if you have, you know, if you haven't, you can go and you can just scroll through a couple times and find an instance of, hey, this guy looks shady, or you know. And of course, a lot of those suspicions were directed at people of color, right? And so Jennifer Ebenhardt and her lab, they just kind of studied that phenomenon on the app, and they put in some safeguards for when you want to report a suspicious person, that you go through this like mental exercise of responding to these questions about why you think this person is suspicious. And most of the time when people go through that questionnaire, they decide not to post, because they kind of realize that like, oh, okay, well, they're not really doing anything. Their behavior isn't really odd. Just because I haven't seen them here before doesn't mean that they aren't a member of the neighborhood. And so that just goes to show you that even us as human beings, the way that we analyze and critique and use technology can be problematic. And so then we're taking our model for how we design, code, and interact, and we're training an artificial intelligence that we don't fully understand the choices and decisions it will make. And this was really clear when Twitter allowed an AI to start a Twitter account and begin tweeting and interacting with people in the Twitter community. And quickly that AI began making racist statements and things like that, because it was simply mimicking and making decisions and choices based on the data that it was curating via Twitter. So AI and representational equity. So there are, of course, representation issues among coders and engineers. There's representation issues in the academy and scholarship. Like uh, this is virtually new for a lot of us outside of STEM and engineering. So we're just now being able to critique and analyze and explore the ethics of what this all means for society. Um, so, for example, AI. Amazon was using AI in a hiring effort that showed bias toward men in hiring by downgrading women colleges that were listed on CVs and terms associated with women that were listed on curriculum vitae as well. And so AI, this was about a decade ago. So Amazon decided to, you know, stop that process and the use of that tool. Of course, since then, there have been some safeguards placed into these types of hiring tools, but they're not 100% sound, right? And so Fortune 500 companies, 99% of them use AI for hiring. And so that means your resume, your curriculum vitae goes into a machine and it searches for key terms and words and makes decisions on whether you should get an interview or whether your application should move forward in the process. And so we already know like the early 90s talk shows, right? The um uh Sally Jeffrey Raphael's, the Oprahs and all those shows. I just remember as a kid watching every one of those talk shows, Ricky Lake talk about the hiring issues with us as people making decisions, right? The studies that have been done on if you have a more ethnic sounding name versus a more Eurocentric name, that you get moved into the process a lot further. There's also bias and hallucinations that perpetuate stereotypes in um, artificial intelligence, especially generative text. And a large reason for that is because there's a lack of representation in Silicon Valley and engineers and coders that are actually feeding this black box what's going to be eventually output. And so a hallucination, for example, so I'm like I mentioned earlier, I'm an industrial design enthusiast. And so when I first started playing around with AI, I was like, oh, this is a great tool because oftentimes with industrial design, you go and it's one of those topics that you just keep, unless you start reading books across the web, you just keep finding the same articles over and over and over and over. And it's usually like, what is industrial design? And so I was like, oh, maybe I can use this tool to kind of further some of my shorter reading. And so I asked for a list of industrial designers who were African American. Um, and it gave me a list of like 25 names. And I instantly, just being an enthusiast, I went through that list and only two were actually African American, and the rest were not at all, not even remotely close. And so that's an example of a hallucination, right? It gave me this matter-of-fact response that said, hey, here's a list of African American industrial designers. And if I didn't have the base knowledge to critique that, I could have just taken that and said, oh, this is great, and continued down this wrong path of misidentifying people and not having an adequate list for what I wanted to explore. Restrictions and errors for prompts related to keywords important for various identity groups. And so if you get into identity groups in terms of gender and race, ethnicity, there's going to be certain key terms that will just be flagged. We have a Black Students United group of students on our campus, and one of the students came to me and was like, hey, this we posted a series of posts about events that we have coming up on Instagram, and they got flagged. Like they're not allowing the post to go forward, and it's just kind of stuck in this limbo. What do we do? Because there's nothing lewd or obscene in the post. And what I had to educate those students on is that the way that these algorithms look for things, it's trying to, prevent racist acts from occurring online, but it also is doing that in a way that prevents education about things like racism and homophobia and xenophobia, because it'll flag these terms and try to give it a context and say, oh no, this doesn't meet our policies and guidelines. And so you can think about the inflation of that happening in these AI hallucinations as well. Struggles with content diversity, um, job placement, and future of the workforce. So I don't know how many of you have had this conversation, but there is an obvious concern about job displacement in many fields, for many tasks, many projects. The World Economic Forum has estimated that artificial intelligence will replace some 85 million jobs by 2025. And so that is also a fundamental concern that we have moving forward in terms of representational equity. So AI and resource equity, right? Like access and costs and expense. So the digital divide, which someone mentioned in the chat earlier in terms of our fears, the cost and infrastructure struggles with internet access. I know on our campus, one of the biggest kind of changes that came out of the pandemic and the biggest realizations for us as a campus was when we had to go into lockdown and we had to shut the campus down. We quickly realized from student feedback that I can't learn. I don't have internet access at home, or the access that is available in my neighborhood at an affordable price is not adequate enough for me to do my work. And so overnight, our what we call our Discovery Hub, which is technology support for students, but they also check out technology devices. Most devices that they check out are like iPads, right? So we went from most of our checkouts being iPads to us partnering with AT&T to release hotspots to our students so that they could have adequate internet during the pandemic. And that number just kept increasing. We were just lending out thousands of hotspots, right? And so that access just in general to even get on the internet is already an issue in the digital divide. Knowledge and exposure to technology, including AI, is another issue, right? Because if our institutions are not equipped and ready and professors are not addressing AI in the classroom, then students that don't have the means to get information or the time to get information are not going to get that. Access to information, learning, and support to technology, including AI. So once I even have access to it, if I'm not learning this in school, where am I? Who are my resources? Who are my mentors? Who are my coaches? Who are the people that I can interact with to better understand this technology? AI marketing and ad targeting are predicted to increase consumerism and economic stratification. So think about how we can be in our own online bubble, right? I have a design colleague of mine who's from Baltimore, and we connect remotely. And he was previously in law enforcement, and we got into this conversation about uh, police brutality and things like that. And and he was like, well, what about black on black crime? And I was like, well, he was like, we don't often talk about that. And I was like, we talk about that a whole lot. And I'm like, there's panels and just stuff all the time about that. Like that's going back to like the 70s and 80s. And so what we did, he was like, really? And so I exposed him to a couple of sources. And then he was like, I'm curious. And so we put our Facebook accounts, our YouTube accounts, and our Instagram accounts. Like we just kind of took pictures of like the first 30 things in our feed and compared them. Vastly different, right? Just vastly different. The type of news we were getting, the sources we were getting, regardless of views and identities that we had that overlapped. It kind of almost scaled our differences in terms of what was coming to us. Environmental strain due to computing power required to run models. So there's a rising cost of AI, which will also reduce access to AI, right? So right now we're in this portion of, and we'll talk about the hype cycle a bit later, where AI is all the buzz and everybody's kind of reinvesting and releasing things that they've been working on for years because it seems like it has the public's attention. Well, it is very expensive. Running a simple ChatGPT query alone costs 36 cents every time you hit enter. And so that's about $700,000 a day. There is right now across Bing, Google, ChatGPT, there is not a profitable version for artificial intelligence. And so that's going to become an issue. You may have seen things like explainpaper.com and elicit.org and ChatGPT itself. They very quickly, within months and some in weeks, went to paid models. And so that becomes an issue for our students who don't have the means to pay to get access to pro accounts and things like that. Okay, so we're gonna do another pause for the cause, another delayed chat. And so before we get into some of the ways that some of the use cases and things where AI is being used to address inequities, I wanted to just get a brainstorm from all of us on how might AI support or enhance equity in higher education? And so I'm going to set another 1 minute timer, and I'm doing that now. The prompt is, how might AI support or enhance equity in higher education? Uh, 25 seconds left. Oops. Go ahead and submit. I actually skipped one slide back. But yeah, go ahead and submit your ideas. AI helping students in terms of learning and getting up to speed in classes. Support for folks wanting to learn it, kind of leveling the playing field. Expanding horizons to learn about other cultures you think you know about. So yeah, right, because sometimes some of those taboo topics, we're so fearful of having those conversations that we can, have a dialogue with AI that makes us individually feel safe, that will then hopefully empower us to have conversations with people. Because of some of the hallucinations and issues with AI, we can kind of, move forward and have conversations with actual people once we get out of that bubble. Addressing learning needs. So a fundamental principle of universal design for learning is, uh, representation and addressing the learning needs of individual students, which seems impossible in a class of 60 or even 30. Um, but AI can be a means of doing that. And I'm working with several faculty on designing assignments and things that get at that, like addressing the learner diversity in their classroom through using generative text. Assistance with written assignments. Okay. Thank you all for engaging in that exercise. So, one thing, the way I want to start this conversation about ways that it can be leveraged is with this concept that I recently learned called critical distance. So, I was writing an article that hasn't come out yet, but basically, I was looking at, like, is simulated empathy in chatbots better than the absence of empathy altogether, right? And so, I went into a deep dive of just previous scholarship and literature, and then more recent articles. And so it was looking at these chatbot models, like, when you interact with like an airline or a hotel, and those types of models for customer service and customer experience. And it compared models that made an attempt at empathy to mimic human empathy through language versus more old school models and chatbots that didn't. And so, by and large, what folks in these studies, they did prefer the attempt at empathy, and they said it did make the process feel more warm and smooth and more connected. Um, but also, most folks did have a critical distance. So most folks did realize that even though I'm having this experience, this is not a real person. And there are going to be some things that I have to take with a grain of salt. And so this concept of critical distance is, if you've ever seen the movie Her with Joaquin Phoenix, through the course of that movie, his critical distance kind of uh, closes, and he begins to really get deep feelings for this artificial intelligence. And so critical distance is very, very essential when it comes to interacting with AI. And it's probably one of the, I know prompt engineering is often touted as a skill that we have to teach our students. And prompt engineering is knowing how to prompt an AI to get an output that aligns with what you want, and having the ability to critique what you get out of it. Critical distance, I would argue, is more important. Like, how do I view AI as a tool and not as something that's going to give me like a product, like an entire paper, or give me knowledge that I don't have myself. And how do I look at it as more of a tool that can help me analyze, critically think, and evaluate? I don't want to make decisions. I don't want it to make decisions for me, but it can parse and evaluate at a scale that I can't as a human being to help me come to some conclusion. But I need critical distance in order to see something and say, nope, that's not right. That doesn't feel right. Try again. If I don't have that critical distance, I think that's where our students will get in a lot of trouble. That's where we, even as professionals, using tools like this, will get in a lot of trouble. And also in a broader sense, another concept is the hype cycle, right? So right now, like us in education, we're feeling a lot of pressure to like AI, 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 AI. You go to, I've I did an exercise with a colleague here, and I went through my calendar last year and I looked at like how many AI workshops, webinars, conference sessions did I attend. So I did like some keyword searching for AI, machine learning, artificial intelligence on my Google Calendar, and I came up with like 18 experiences, right? And most of them were that kind of like intro experience to AI. Um, and so that's a lot of kind of exposure to just the dialogue and conversation about AI. But that's going to go down eventually, right? So in the bottom left is this figure that talks about the hype cycle, which is something out of the Gardner group. And so there's a technology trigger, like, some new instance of technology. In this case, like in the 80s, we started looking at chatbots and artificial intelligence, machine learning. And then there's a peak of inflated expectations. So I would argue that like 2 years ago, when ChatGPT came on the scene, it was like, oh, this is interesting. We're all curious about it. And then Google was like, well, we've been working on this for 20 years. Hurry up, let's put something out. And all these companies were following suit with like, okay, we didn't think this was ready, but there's enough attention to it that we need to put it out. And so now we had these kind of inflated expectations. I would argue we're still in that phase, right? Eventually, there's going to be a trough of disillusionment, right? Where we look at it and we say, wasn't really all what we thought it was cracked up to be, and there's no real promise. It's too expensive. It's too cumbersome. It has too much bias. All these things. And for some technologies, they could stay in the trough of disillusionment. And you can probably think as an educator through some of the vendor softwares and other technologies that kind of swept us, what things didn't actually make it out of that trough of disillusionment. And then after that, it could be that there's a slope of enlightenment, like, oh, actually, there's a few use cases where this is really good. And then that becomes like our plateau of productivity. Like, okay, this is how we use and interact with this iteration and version of artificial intelligence. And so I say beware the hype cycle because, as you all know, in education, we get a lot of softwares and technologies pushed on us, and sometimes we don't have time to adequately evaluate them. So it is important to explore and play around and test and critique different things so that when they do come to this peak of inflated expectations, you know how to critically evaluate them. Okay, so here are a few use cases. Oops. So this is not an exhaustive list. So IBM developed a more equitable facial recognition system by training algorithms on diverse data sets. You've probably heard about some of the faux pas with Google Images and people of color, some of the issues with CCTV and law enforcement and inadequate profiling using, you know, systems that were essentially trained by the programmers and coders creating them, uh, who were predominantly white. And so the contrast and the way it analyzes images had a bias toward that. And then Zebra Medical Vision is an AI health tech company which provides tools for equitable medical imaging analysis. ensuring patients receive accurate diagnoses, regardless of racial background. And so just now, in the past few years, we have been looking at like, okay, how do we mitigate some of the bias in these algorithms and black box technologies that we've created with generative AI and generative text and generative text to image. A few education use cases. So one thing that I help faculty with when designing assignments and experiences for students centered around AI is promoting critical distance through course projects, assignments, and activities. So how does that look? One is how do we get students to see AI as a tool? You empower them to critique it from a position of their expertise. So I've designed assignments that like we're in the San Joaquin Valley of California in terms of where I'm located, which is the traditional land of the Yokut and Mono peoples in terms of where we inhabit. Um, but we have several issues that are specific to this area, right? So we have like we have like Cesar Chavez's movement was largely predominantly in this area. So migrant farming, we have water issues. We were going through a drought for quite some time. And so there's a specific context of how we are impacted by things in the Central Valley, as we call it. And so I worked with professors to create assignments where students will prompt AI on a topic that they're an expert in, like being from Fresno, and be able to critique it. And that's their assignment is they critique this essay or article or blog post that AI is generated based on their context as an expert. And so they get to see that like, okay, there's a lot wrong with this. There's a lot of misnomers. There's a lot of stereotyping. There's a lot of things that are absent and not considered in what was generated. And you can and then I've designed assignments that are have a more fun spin on them, right? Where it's like the students get to pick any intellectual property that they're an expert on. So whether that's Star Wars or Marvel or DC, and they get AI to, generate some text based on that, and they get to critique that. So that's a good way to promote critical distance in students. Arizona State has an AI boot camp. There's prompt engineering programs at University of Texas and Purdue. There's Course Hero, which I'm excited about. They're going to have a teaching with AI certification. I think that starts March 4th. Coursera has courses freely available on AI and machine learning. And so the reason why I'm kind of listing those is because if you're not prepared as a professor to uh, kind of change your curriculum and suit it toward this means, just providing resources and opportunities for your students to explore these things is super important because representation is going to be critical as we move into a space that's driven by AI and machine learning. And career preparation for students that have those skills are going to be important as well. Um, so then there's opportunities, right, of how we can currently use this tool. So our universal design for learning specialists here in my office, we've been evaluating several of the tools where you can, it's not text to image, it's like a text from image, where you can upload an image and get the AI to describe it. And so we have a lot of professors on our campus that struggle with alt text on images for folks who use screen readers. And so AI can be a tool where you can get a decent visual description of what's going on in a photo. But you need to do that with critical distance, right? So you can upload the photos and have it provide alt text, and then there's going to be some fluff that you need to cut out because it gets a little bit poetic and artistic with the way it describes some visuals that are not really essential to understanding what's going on in the image. But it's pretty good, right? Institutionally trained chatbots for student support. There's a lot of institutions that have been using chatbots for a very long time. And typically the way chatbots prior to general text were trained was like, hey, we need to feed it a data set. And so you had to like say, okay, these are the current documents and policies and web pages that are current that we want it to reference. And so it wouldn't be referencing everything that the institution had, but it'll be referencing some things. When I went to the Google Cloud Next conference, they're playing with a Vertex AI that it uses every file, every web page, everything in a specific domain that pertains to you so that you can query and call up information as a knowledge base. And so a lot of institutions are investing in AI in that way as well, where, okay, it can comb our website and it can contextualize, even if there's old information on there, that it's old information. And it can contextualize what's the latest policy, what's the newest policy. And so it's a more dynamic means of giving students access to information on procedures and policies and things that are relevant to their college journey. AI assisted grading. So there's been a lot of talk and experimentation with grading using AI, especially of open-ended short answer type questions and responses, predictive analytics for student success, intelligent tutoring systems. One thing that I do tell students about in terms of AI that's a benefit is that AI can't get annoyed with you. Like if you ask a friend or a professor or a person too many questions, as confused as you might be, they can begin to get annoyed or frustrated. But AI is not capable of getting annoyed or frustrated, so that's a definite benefit because it provides a 24-hour tutor. And AI is very good at analyzing when you give it a lot of information. So that's another skill for critical distance for students is if a student used it more to like, hey, I wrote these 3 paragraphs and I want you to analyze it in some way, or hey, I read this article and I want you to analyze it in some way. AI is better at that when it has like a contextual knowledge base for a thread, as opposed to an open-ended question that AI responds to. Natural language processing for student feedback, language interpretation for multilingual speakers. And so I used to coordinate a tutoring program in our Learning Assistance Center. And one of the biggest struggles for some of our international students was they're in lecture, and when they sit down to write, they have to kind of analyze in one of their primary, secondary languages and then interpret into English, and vice versa for students that I know that went and studied abroad. And so AI is a game changer in that sense, right? I can maybe write something in my primary language because I can write faster and I can have it quickly interpreted and I can, change and revise after that. But I don't have to dread and have a long, arduous process to getting to the output or product that I need to submit. Employee wellness and institutional productivity. So the job displacement thing is scary. What is a bit hopeful is that we all know in higher education we are overworked and overtaxed. So like nobody told us when you sign up to be an instructional designer or a professor that you also have to be a web designer, a counselor, a personal assistant, like you name it, right? We are it. And so how do you automate or scale some of those things that you do so that you can prioritize and emphasize some of the more critical things that AI is not capable of doing in your role and job? There are some AI listed here that are relevant to higher education specifically. But I want to encourage you to explore beyond this list, and I will provide these slides for folks, but you can, take a screenshot or what have you. But I want to show you something that's just amazing. So there is this site called there's an AI for that.com. And if you haven't been, this is just beyond. I want to share with you what this experience is like. Let's see here. And then we'll jump back into the presentation. So, of course, there's some larger APIs, right? Most AI tools are pulling from um, the same APIs from whether it's Google's, Microsoft's, which is ChatGPT, or any other of the major AI systems, whether it's constitutional AI or generative AI. They're all pulling from the same code base, but there's just specific context that they can put it in. And so there's an AI for that is a website that curates instances of those APIs being called on. And so you can see at the top, which I love, because like once you begin using it, you just get to see it grow. So there's 1,030 AIs for 16,604 tasks and 4,847 jobs. And so you can type in a keyword, like there might be some biology folks in the room, and I type in biology, and there's just a litany of different AIs and GPTs that are solely focused on biology. And sometimes kind of narrowing the context of AI really helps it to become a better tool in terms of when you're using it. Something as open as GPT is more inclined for hallucinations than something more narrowed to a specific domain or topic. So I just love just love that site. So if y'all get a chance to explore that, it does have that rabbit hole effect. So please don't do it when you have somewhere to be or something to do in the next hour and a half. Um, let's see here. Back to the presentation. And because this is such a dynamic topic and we're all exploring AI in our own ways, now I wanted to brought the presentation back up just to come back to this one slide. But now I want to open it up for Q&A. As Sean was saying earlier, if you have questions, populate them in the Q&A. He's going to engage me in prompting me with the questions that you do ask, and I can respond. Because that's probably where most of the good stuff from this webinar experience is going to come from.
That's great. Thank you so much, William. Yeah, actually, we do have quite a few questions in the Q&A, so we'll just go ahead and start in with those. One of the early questions that came in, and I think you may have addressed this to a certain extent already, but one of the early questions that came in was from Jane Rubin. And the question was, if we don't know how AI is making decisions, why are we depending on it so much? How did that sort of happen? And who is responsible for evaluating the validity of its decisions?
Right. Oh boy. So I think what happened was just the general release, and I would even argue the beta release of GPT. So generative text is nothing new, but 2 years ago when GPT just did that kind of open release, I just think it was at the moment where we just saw some potential, some difference in what this thing was. And so I don't even know that, and in fact, we have proof that they didn't even predict how it would blow up, because if you remember early on, they were having a lot of server issues. So they didn't even adequately provide the memory and storage necessary for the response that we gave that program. So I think that was just like a phenomenon. And then Microsoft and Google and all these other players that have been exploring this stuff and using it in their companies for a long time, they saw this and they were like, oh, we have this technology. We need to capitalize on this attention, right? And so the black box question, that's my biggest concern too. Like it's there's no way to really understand what's going on, and AI experts and researchers are exploring that, but there's no way to really understand it. And so yeah, I think that's why I said critical distance is the most important skill to teach, as opposed to prompt engineering or just teaching people how to use AI tools. It's I tell faculty here all the time, before you teach anybody how to use an AI tool, teach them how to critique what an AI tool provides. A lot of our faculty were very fearful of students, using it for plagiarism and cheating and things like that. And they had all these concerns. And so when I started talking to students about AI, one, most of them hadn't really heard about it. Like as far as Dateline, NBC, and 2020, and a lot of the ways that we hear about these things, New York Times, students get their news in a different way, and we all live in this kind of bubble of like we're in the horses, we're seeing nothing but horses, and so most students hadn't even heard about it. When they saw it in action, their response and reaction to it was exactly the response and reaction of faculty. Ugh, I don't know. That seems kind of weird. I don't like that. So is it looking at my data? Is it spying on me? Like same exact concerns. And so that's one thing is I think as a society, we need to approach AI with a critical lens as opposed to just a like output lens of like, oh, what can it do for me? Why is it doing what it's doing? And is what it's doing even valuable to me?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Kind of following up on that, there's another question that came in from the chat. In what ways do you think faculty members can contribute to the development and implementation of ethical AI practices within their academic departments?
Oh yeah. So I'm on this subcommittee for our campus, and I think uh, there's some leaders in this respect. And my of course my context is a bit biased being on the West Coast, but like CSU Fullerton, Arizona State, there's some institutions that like early on they started exploring guidelines and laying out guidelines for ethical use and things like that. So us as an institution at California State University Fresno, last year we kind of got the message that like, hey, well, no, let's just see what this is all about. Let's see what, our because we're part of a system, let's see what the system says about it. And then a year later, now we're like, okay, nobody was really doing anything, so we need to put together a task force. And so we just started exploring last semester, like, what does this mean for us as an institution? I'm on a subcommittee for work integrity, so we're talking about like training of employees, employee usage, and ethical usage of AI. And so we're exploring things like decision making, right? Like admissions and enrollment, they have to make a lot of decisions, and it's scary to think that AI could like
Oh,
make decisions about
oh,
who gets admitted and who doesn't.
yep, agreed. I think it's good that there are some, I mean, there are some institutions that are doing committees like that. There are some institutions that are providing some resources. I think it's also important for faculty to understand sort of what policies they want to institute in their own classrooms, in case
Yeah,
their universities are not
right.
providing those policies for them.
Hmm.
Um, there was another question, and I'm actually fascinated myself by the idea of critical distance. I hadn't ever heard that phrase before, and I think it's sort of it definitely resonates with the feeling that I have when I'm using AI.
Hmm.
Um, but there's a question that came in, given the importance that you give to critical distance. Um, this is from Anne Curry Stevens. She wants to understand the idea accurately. How does it differ from objectivity?
Hmm. Hmm. Objectivity. So I would I would say that critical objectivity is maybe an element of it. So objectivity is like if I'm thinking of objectivity in relationship to like a chatbot or general text, I'm thinking I'm objectively looking at this thing like a tool, but I guess even in doing that, like I don't know. I have my own gripes with objectivity in general. I just don't think that we can just mentally kind of leave everything behind and look at something. But I would guess in theory, objectivity would be me looking at that tool as a tool. Um, and in that, I can like discredit some things that it outputs that maybe shouldn't be discredited. Or I can give credit to some things that give me confirmation bias because I'm like, oh yeah, that's an objective, logical kind of response. Makes sense. Critical distance is just the scientific inquiry of what you're getting out of it. Like I'm actively, I don't care if I get something that it seems to confirm or something that seems in disagreement, I'm going to actively pursue what it's feeding me and validate and evaluate what's going on here. Because and you almost really need that because of the black box concept. Like you don't get to see it working. Like even when using a calculator, you're using a calculator and you can kind of track back like what it's doing. You understand some of the functions, like you understand arithmetic, you can track back and check your math. And with something like this, you can't really do that, which is why I think critical distance is so important.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's an interesting, I think the thing that struck me about critical distance was that, especially when we're talking about AI empathy or, the sort of that kind of feedback that you get from AI, it feels, and you pointed this out, it feels more sort of frictionless than encountering a human. Like a human will get bored of your questions or get frustrated with you or whatever. AI will never do that. So there's actually this interesting temptation to not have critical distance with AI because it's so much easier to deal with than some
Yeah.
human beings.
Than
So,
real people. Yes.
so I think that temptation is there. And so another person asked how critical distance is different from critical thinking. And I think that it's my personal thought is that's in application, basically. It's about you're doing this with AI and it's a specific kind of
Yeah.
instance of critical
Yeah.
thinking.
Yeah.
But I
And,
think there's a certain mood to that of AI is just friendly. It's easier to use.
uh,
So the
yeah.
person, and so I think there's a temptation to not have that critical distance.
Right. Right. And yeah, and so it's kind of one of those things where you can engage it in conversations literally about anything and you can become and 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 once I learned about critical distance, I even started applying that to like algorithms and search relevance and things like the way my digital world is curated for me. It's like, wait a minute, this isn't I need to remember that this isn't reality. Like this isn't the full picture. This isn't multiple perspectives. This is a computer trying to predict what I am interested in.
Right.
Um, and like one of the biggest and most obvious perpetrators of this is TikTok. If you use TikTok, if you one time stop on a video just because it catches your eye for some reason, you will for the next few weeks get fed that type of content, even though you're not interested in it. I think
Yeah. Yeah.
Jane.
Jane had your hand up. So Jane, you want
Oops. Yeah, so I wanted to follow up. So I had another question about like the whole idea and what you just said about hallucinations. It's almost like so I'm a scientist. So I laughed, I'm gonna be honest, I laughed when I heard that people were going into Chat GPT and then trying to use the references that they came up with. Because I was like, I would never even use it. I mean, I don't know it that, like you say, not being sure about it. I didn't know it that well. And I was like, I didn't even think to even use it. I mean, I used it for like, putting in information and seeing what it came up. It was more when I first started using
Right.
it. But so when you said that, it just kind of a light just went on. It was like it's still trying to please you, which is kind of interesting. And so I mean, and first, and I have to leave, but I thought this was a fantastic. I'm so glad I did the session that
Oh,
I did
great.
critical distance. That was the first time I've ever heard of that. And I really would love to have a follow-up session on critical distance, because I think I did a survey with my students at the beginning of the semester. I teach dental students. And I asked them, have you ever used AI to do to generate study materials? Or how have you used it? And are you interested in using it? And so I was trying to get a sense of what their use was, but also their attitudes towards AI. And pretty much what you said is what I found, is that the distrust is there. It's like,
Yep.
I'd rather trust my credentialed professor
Right.
or credentialed books, because I don't know where this information is coming from. And
Uh-huh.
so yeah, so just this idea of critical distance, I think, is going to be the key for training people how to use it, because it's already being used,
Right.
and the bias is real.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And it's so interesting that you mentioned your students' response, because every other sector that you read about, consumer trends and thinking, a big trend in like fashion and products is that Gen Z and Gen Alpha are very critical of like, where are these pants sourced from? Was there slave labor used to produce this? What, like, they are very, in terms of identity critique, they want to know that like they're associating and aligning themselves with brands and products that are aligned with their own values. And so I think that's a promising thing going forward, is those two generations in particular, who are probably going to get the brunt of the experience with generative text and AI, have that mindset and mentality.
But I think my biggest concern is like the rapid perpetuation of even more bias. So,
Mhm.
and because your general public, when I think about my students and I tell them, I said, part of your privilege is the fact that you're here, that you're getting this level of education. I said, that's part of the privilege. I said, most people don't have this. So then the issue is you've got these billions of people who are not being trained in critical distance,
Right.
who are being fed this information, and don't know how to evaluate. And you can just look at YouTube and look at the coffee hack and all this kind of hacks and all this kind of stuff. You don't need to take your diabetes medication. Just do this coffee baking soda
Right.
hack.
Right.
Oh. I'm just like, I'm sitting there, and I'm a pharmacologist, so I'm sitting there going, oh my gosh, who's seeing this?
Right.
How many people are seeing this? And how is it adversely impacting their lives? So that's, for me, is the biggest concern, is not just, how we're training our students, but the fact that the people that we can't train and how they're being exposed to it and what's going to happen in their lives as a result of using it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jen.
But thank you
Thank you.
for this.
I think we'll actually wrap a little bit early. There were a couple of other questions, but I think you kind of addressed them in the context of other conversations. So if that's all good with everybody, I think we'll wrap a little bit early. And thank you very much, William. This was just fantastic. It was a really great conversation about equity. And you introduced everybody to this new term, critical distance, which I'm just going to go down whatever rabbit hole is appropriate for that. Very, very great. Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you all.